Chapter 18, The Progressive Era, 1900 to 1916, Part 4. The most significant political development of early 20th century America was the rise of the national state. Nationalization was occurring everywhere. National corporations dominated the economy. National organizations, like the American Medical Association, began to raise the incomes and respective professions. Even sports developed national leagues in this period. Progressives believed that only an energetic national government could establish the social conditions of freedom. Poverty, economic insecurity, and an absence of industrial democracy were new national problems that could only be solved on the national level. Herbert Croly, editor of the New Republic, argued that the democratic national state was an alternative to the forces that controlled Americans' lives, whether the narrow interests that manipulated politics or corporations. Croly suggested that Jeffersonian ends of democratic self-determination and individual freedom could be secured only through the Hamiltonian means of government intervention in the economy. Theodore Roosevelt was the first of the Progressive-era presidents to address this question. As vice president, he became the youngest president ever to hold office after an anarchist assassinated William McKinley in 1901. He was an impetuous and energetic man who celebrated the strenuous life of manly adventure and daring, and he became the model for the 20th century president, actively and continuously involved in domestic and foreign policy and setting the political agenda. Roosevelt advanced a program he called the Square Deal, which addressed problems of economic consolidation by distinguishing between good and bad corporations. Soon after taking office, Roosevelt shocked the business world by prosecuting the Northern Securities Company, a holding company created by financier J.P. Morgan to run 3 western railroads that monopolized rail transport between the Great Lakes and the Pacific. In 1904, the Supreme Court handed the antitrust movement a significant victory by ordering Northern Securities dissolved. Roosevelt also believed the president should help settle labor disputes as a neutral third party and not simply act in favor of business, as had previous presidents. In 1902, when a strike paralyzed the coal industry, he brought union leaders and managers to the White House and settled the strike by appointing a commission. Re-elected in 1904, Roosevelt advocated more direct economic regulations, including reinforcing the Interstate Commerce Commission, whose powers had been restricted by the Supreme Court. In 1906, public opinion had shifted in support of Roosevelt, and Congress passed the Hepburn Act, giving the ICC power to set railroad rates, which was an important step in giving the federal government regulatory power. While many businessmen supported the creation of new federal agencies to improve consumer product safety, they were alarmed by Roosevelt's calls for federal inheritance and income taxes and interstate business regulation. Roosevelt was also an avid outdoorsman. While the United States led the world in conserving wilderness areas, having established the first national park at Yellowstone in 1872, it had no national conservation policy until Roosevelt's administration. He ordered that millions of acres be set aside as wildlife preserves and urged creation of new national parks. Conservation was typically progressive in some ways. Experts would help the government serve the public good while preventing special interests from damaging the environment. But conservation also served efficiency and control, as conservation aimed to control the exploitation of minerals and forests on natural lands, not prevent it. In the West, water was especially scarce and required regulation in order to conserve and distribute it fairly. Roosevelt's successor to run for president in 1908 was William Howard Taft, a federal judge from Ohio and former governor of the Philippines. Taft defeated William Jennings Bryan in his third unsuccessful run for the presidency. Taft was progressive in that he believed government should go beyond laissez-faire principles of the 19th century, and he pursued antitrust more aggressively than had Roosevelt. In 1911, he convinced the Supreme Court to declare John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and order its breakup into separate companies. This case, along with the similar prosecution of the American Tobacco Corporation, birthed the rule of reason in antitrust policy, allowing the government to distinguish between good companies and the bad companies that stifled competition. Taft also supported the 16th Amendment, which allowed Congress to establish a graduated national income tax, thus giving the national government a more reliable and flexible revenue source than the tariff. But Taft, despite his progressive policies, tended to ally with the more conservative wing of the Republican Party, and a dispute in 1910 with reform-minded officials within his administration alienated progressives. In 1912, when Roosevelt failed in challenging Taft for the Republican nomination, he launched a new and independent progressive party. The different tendencies in progressive thought were expressed in the 1912 presidential campaign, which saw a four-way contest between Taft, Roosevelt, Democrat Woodrow Wilson, and Socialist Eugene V. Debs. They all took a different position in what became a national debate on the relationship between political and economic freedom in the age of big business. Taft, the most conservative, argued that economic individualism could still be the basis of society if business and government worked together to solve social ills. Debs stood at the opposite end of the political spectrum from Taft, and although most Americans did not support the socialist revolutionary goals, their proposals for public ownership of railroads and banks, unemployment assistance, and laws limiting working hours and setting a minimum wage were typically progressive. But the fight between Roosevelt and Wilson over the federal government's role in the economy captivated most voters in 1912. While they both believed government was necessary to preserve individual freedom, they disagreed about the dangers of increasing government powers. Wilson, believing in states' rights and laissez-faire, was progressive in his policies as New Jersey's governor, where he helped create workmen's compensation and state regulation of utilities and railroads. Influenced by Brandeis, Wilson argued that government had to be independent of big business and restore market competition without creating big government. His program, The New Freedom, involved strengthening antitrust, protecting workers' rights to organize unions, and encouraging small business. Wilson thus hoped to create the conditions for real economic competition without increasing government regulation of the economy. To Roosevelt and his supporters, Wilson's program was outdated, as it focused on small business but ignored inevitable economic concentration in the interests of professionals, consumers, and labor. Roosevelt's program, The New Nationalism, accepted business and the need for strong government regulation to check its abuses. Roosevelt proposed heavy personal and corporate taxes and federal regulation of industries such as rail, mining, and oil. His Progressive Party adopted a platform with many other progressive reformers, such as women's suffrage, an 8-hour day and living wage for workers, and a national system of social insurance covering medical care, unemployment, and old age. This program contained much of the agenda that came to define liberalism in the 20th century. The split in the Republican Party gave Wilson a resounding victory, although Roosevelt came in second, embarrassing Taft. Wilson became a strong president. He regularly dealt with Congress regarding legislation, and he was the first president to hold regular press conferences. He was the first president to deliver messages personally to Congress. With Democrats controlling Congress, Wilson pushed to implement his particular progressive vision. He passed the Underwood Tariff, which reduced duties on imports but made up for them with a graduated income tax on the wealthy. The Clayton Act of 1914 exempted unions from antitrust laws and barred courts from issuing injunctions that limited workers' rights to strike. Other laws outlawed child labor, limiting work in railroads to 8 hours per day, and gave credit to farmers who stored their crops in government warehouses. Some of Wilson's policies seemed more in line with Roosevelt's New Nationalism than his own New Freedom agenda of 1912, and he abandoned antitrust for more government economic regulation. Wilson pushed Congress to create the Federal Reserve System in 1913, which gave government-regulated banks the ability to issue currency, help failing banks, and influence interest rates. In 1914, Congress, at Wilson's urging, also created the Federal Trade Commission, tasked with investigating and prosecuting unfair business activity such as price fixing and monopoly. By 1916, progressive era efforts had vastly increased the powers of the national state.